Let me ask you something before we even begin. When you think about the movie Mask, the 1985 Peter Bogdanovich film that made audiences across America cry into their popcorn, what do you picture? You probably picture Cher in a leather jacket. You picture a disfigured boy with an enormous heart. You picture courage, and love, and the kind of tearful triumph that Hollywood does so well. You picture the version of the story that someone decided you were allowed to see. But what if I told you that the real woman behind that story, the woman Cher played, the woman who raised Rocky Dennis against every odd the medical world threw at her, sat down before her death and said things about her son, about herself, and about that movie that the feel-good narrative simply cannot hold? What if the truth was bigger, stranger, more painful, and more honest than anything that ever made it onto a cinema screen? That is exactly what happened. And today, we are going to talk about it without softening a single edge. This is the story of Florence "Rusty" Tullis, the real Rocky Dennis's real mother, told the way she would have wanted it told. Plainly, without apology, and with every uncomfortable detail left exactly where she put it. Roy Lee Dennis came into the world on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California. His mother was Florence Tullis, who went by Rusty, a Brooklyn-born woman with a motorcycle, a sharp mouth, and a philosophy about life that she had assembled entirely on her own terms. His father was Roy Dennis, her second husband. As a baby, Roy wouldn't sleep unless someone was rocking him. And so his family started calling him Rocky, and that name stuck to him for the rest of his life, which, as it turned out, would be exactly 16 years. In his very early childhood, Rocky had the kinds of health complaints that don't immediately alarm anyone. Ear infections, sinus problems, a sickly kid, certainly, but not a mystery. Then, around the age of 2, he went in for routine tonsillectomy, and during the preparatory x-rays, a technician noticed something wrong with his skull. What followed was close to a year of appointments at UCLA Medical Center, multiple visits every single week, until a diagnosis finally came down. The name of the condition was craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. It is a disease so extraordinarily rare that when Rocky was diagnosed in 1963, only a handful of cases had ever been formally documented anywhere in the world. The mechanism of the disease is relentless. Abnormal calcium deposits build up inside the skull. The bones thicken. They press outward. They compress the brain, destroy vision, destroy hearing, and distort the face in ways that make a child look unlike anyone around them. The doctors who delivered the diagnosis to Rusty Dennis did not cushion it. They told her that her son would almost certainly be blind, that intellectual disability was likely, that he would probably be dead before he turned 7 years old. 7 years old. He had barely learned to walk. Now here is where the story begins to diverge from every version you have probably heard, because the response of Rusty Dennis to that diagnosis was not what a grief counselor would have scripted. She did not collapse. She did not accept the timeline. She did not sit down quietly with the prognosis and begin preparing herself for the loss. She looked at what the medical establishment had told her, and she essentially decided to treat it as an opening position in a negotiation she had no intention of losing. To understand what Rusty said before she died, you first have to understand who Rusty actually was. Because Cher's portrayal, which Rusty herself later acknowledged was genuinely skillful, was still, by its nature, a version filtered through Hollywood's need to make a woman sympathetic enough for a mass audience. The real Rusty was harder to categorize and far more interesting. Florence Tullis was born on May 29, 1936, in Brooklyn, New York, to a truck driver father. She was Jewish, Brooklyn-raised, and apparently constitutionally incapable of doing what she was told. By 13, she had been kicked out of junior high school for not showing up. By 14, she was running with motorcycle gangs and experimenting with marijuana. At 15, she dropped out of school entirely and took a job dancing at Coney Island. She was not yet old enough to have a learner's permit for a car, but she was already building her own version of a life. At 17, she married her first husband, a truck driver named Tommy Mason. They had a son together, Joshua. That marriage ended, Rusty moved back in with her parents, and then came Roy Dennis, a move to California, and the birth of Rocky in 1961. By the time Rocky's diagnosis arrived, Rusty had already developed what you might call her personal religion. She believed, and told interviewers this repeatedly and without embarrassment, that human beings have more control over their own health than the medical establishment acknowledges. Her view was that if a person could make themselves sick through their thoughts and their spirit, then they could also make themselves well through the same mechanisms. She had decided this early in her life and had never found sufficient reason to revise it. When Rocky had headaches, and he had them constantly, throughout his entire life, because a disease was slowly reshaping his skull from the inside, Rusty would send him to his room and tell him to make himself well. Was that philosophy empowering? Looking at who Rocky became, his humor, his warmth, his absolute refusal to define himself as a victim, there is a case to be made that it gave him something real. But it also carried a shadow, and we will come back to that shadow, because it matters. The biker world she moved in was not incidental to Rocky's life. Rusty was a full member of a motorcycle club called the Turks. The circle of people around her, rough, loyal, hard-living, became Rocky's extended family. The character Gar in the film, played with considerable warmth by Sam Elliott, was based on a real man named Bernie Tullis, Rusty's partner. These people loved Rocky without condition, without discomfort, without the flinching that he encountered in the wider world. That meant something to him. It meant everything. And Rusty's drug use, which the film portrayed with a certain amount of dramatic weight, suggesting a woman struggling and reaching for relief, was something Rusty pushed back on directly when she spoke to journalists. She said she partied, that drugs were part of the lifestyle she had chosen, and that she was not a woman who medicated her pain. She owned her choices. She insisted on that distinction. Whether or not you agree with her framing, the insistence itself is deeply characteristic of who she was. When Mask opened in 1985, it was a significant commercial success. The film earned well over $40 million at the box office. It earned Cher a Best Actress award at the Cannes Film Festival. It earned a great deal of money for a great many people. Rusty Dennis received $15,000 for the film rights to her life and her dead son's story. That number deserves a moment of stillness. $40+ million. $15,000 to the source. And most of that $15,000, according to multiple documented accounts, went directly toward medical bills for her older son Joshua, who was by then dealing with a serious illness of his own. Rusty did not sell Rocky's story for personal gain. She sold it, essentially, to try to keep another child alive. When reporters came to Rusty expecting gratitude and gentle nostalgia, what they got was considerably more bracing. She called the film a fairy tale. Those were her words, not a tribute, not a beautiful memorial. A fairy tale. In a 1986 profile published by the Chicago Tribune, she said she had always imagined that showing Rocky's courage would help disabled children and their parents. She hadn't anticipated that the film would center so heavily on her own story as well. She praised Cher's performance, she was genuine about that, but she was also honest about the unexpected strangeness of watching herself become a central character in a narrative she had always understood as being about her son. I always thought I was perfectly normal, she told the Tribune, and that the rest of the world is nuts. That line is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the more accurate self-descriptions ever committed to print. There were two factual departures from reality that Rusty made clear bothered her. The first was the compression of time, a decade and a half of lived experience squeezed into what the film presents as roughly a single year. That kind of compression is standard Hollywood practice, but it inevitably smooths away the texture of what actually happened. The second bothered her more. Her older son Joshua does not appear in the film at all. He was simply written out of the story. A real person, her firstborn child, erased from her son's life as if he had never existed. Rusty had two sons. The movie gave her one. That omission reportedly never stopped bothering her. And then there was the music. Rocky Dennis was a devoted Bruce Springsteen fan. Not casually, devotedly. Director Peter Bogdanovich built the film's original soundtrack around Springsteen's songs because that music was genuinely part of Rocky's world. But Universal Pictures could not finalize a licensing agreement with Springsteen's label, and without informing Bogdanovich, they replaced the entire soundtrack with Bob Seger tracks. Rusty's response, delivered on a San Francisco talk show in 1985, was brief and precise. She said she didn't think Rocky even knew who Bob Seger was. That is not a long sentence. It did not need to be. Bogdanovich was furious enough to sue Universal for $19 million over the music swap, and it was not until 2004, nearly 20 years later, that the Springsteen songs were restored for director's cut DVD release. By the autumn of 1978, Rocky was 16 years old, and the disease that had been told would kill him before he was 7 had finally begun to collect what it was owed. He was using a wheelchair in his final weeks. The headaches that had been his constant companion since childhood had escalated to a severity that no medication could adequately reach. In early October of that year, the family, Rocky, Rusty, Bernie, and the wider circle of people who formed their world went out together to dinner at a restaurant. Everyone present could see how diminished Rocky had become. That evening, he came home with a headache. Rusty did what she had always done throughout his entire life. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. Rocky Dennis died in his sleep that night. He was 16 years old, almost 17. He had outlived his medical death sentence by nearly a decade. The film depicts Rusty discovering his body herself, a raw, private moment of grief rendered on screen. In reality, at the time of Rocky's death, Rusty was not at home. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with a drug possession charge. It was Bernie who called to tell her that Rocky was gone. Rusty never hid this. She never tried to reshape it into something more cinematic or more flattering. She was where she was. That was the truth, and she gave it plainly. There is something in the make yourself well moment, the last thing she ever said to her son, that is genuinely difficult to sit with. Rusty never described it as a failure. She never said she wished she had done something different. She believed in that philosophy to the end, and she believed it had given Rocky something invaluable, the lifelong conviction that he was not simply dying by degrees, that he had agency over his own body and his own story. Whether she was right about that, whether Rocky experienced it as empowering or as something lonelier, is something only the two of them ever knew. What is on the record is that Rocky Dennis died at home, in his sleep, without machines, without a hospital, without indignity. Rusty had made him a promise about that. She kept it. Joshua Mason was Rusty's first son, born from her first marriage, and he was entirely absent from the film that claimed to tell his family's story. That absence bothered Rusty, and given who Joshua was and what happened to him, it is not difficult to understand why. By 1985, when Mask was released, Joshua was a writer living in San Francisco. Not long after, he was diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, a cancer that became one of the most visible markers of the AIDS crisis that was devastating the gay community throughout the mid-1980s. Joshua was openly gay. Rusty, by all accounts, was supportive of him without reservation, though she was apparently also hoping someday for grandchildren and had, in her characteristically direct fashion, suggested a sperm bank as a potential solution. Joshua died in 1987. He was 32 years old. Rusty had now lost both of her sons. She had sold Rocky's story partly to pay Joshua's medical bills. She had watched one child die slowly in front of her and then watched another follow. And throughout all of it, she maintained the same position. She did not believe in dying. She said that about Joshua explicitly. Joshua doesn't believe in dying, and neither do I, and she meant it not as denial but as a statement of orientation toward life. The money from the film rights that went toward Joshua's treatment represents something the cheerful poster for Mask could never capture. Rusty wasn't a woman trading on her son's memory. She was a woman trying to use every resource she had to keep the people she loved alive. After Rocky died, Rusty moved to San Francisco and, in a turn that surprised people who only knew the leather jacket version of her, took up Buddhism. She worked as a counselor for people dealing with addiction. She had plans, in the mid-1980s, to work with the Shanti Project, an organization supporting terminally ill patients, many of them living with AIDS. The woman who had spent her youth in motorcycle clubs and Coney Island dance halls was, by her 50s, building something quieter and more deliberate. She never stopped riding motorcycles. On October 14, 2006, Florence Tullis, she had returned to using that name, was riding a three-wheeled motorcycle when the right tire came off. She lost control. The bike hit a curb and she was thrown into a telephone pole. What followed was harrowing in a particular way, nobody knew. She was admitted to a hospital as an unidentified elderly woman. It was only when a small item appeared in a local California newspaper describing a 70-year-old woman injured in a motorcycle accident that people who knew her made the connection and found her. She had broken both legs and suffered a punctured lung. She survived the initial crash because of course she did. She was Rusty Dennis. But an infection developed from her injuries, and that was the thing she could not fight off. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006, at Beverly Hospital in Montebello, California. She was 70 years old. Before she died, she said that Rocky's death was just another place to go, and he loved going places. She said she and Joshua simply did not believe in death as a terminus. She never, not once, according to everyone who knew her, asked why me. Not for Rocky, not for Joshua, not for herself at the end. A 1986 profile in the Chicago Tribune described her as a 49-year-old Jewish mother, former drug addict, go-go girl, and Shockley products distributor living in a tidy biker apartment in San Francisco's Mission District with one nephew and three bikers named Pelican, Lenny, and Steve. That description is genuinely one of the finest.